Good afternoon, guys.
Hey guys, how are we?
How's the week going?
Hello.
Well, it's going, right? I think we're all in the thick of budget season, I
I
know
feel like I'm
you've
running
been
on pure
pretty busy,
adrenaline. I'm running on pure adrenaline, guys.
right?
Confession.
That raw energy that comes
Uh,
from poring
uh,
over numbers for weeks at a time.
and I'm running out, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I
Running out
know,
of that raw energy.
we all have kind of seen Eden and Middletown in general. You've been populating my feed on social media quite a bit lately, doing some really cool things like Facebook Live, which, I give you all the credit in the world for doing a live social media broadcast.
It's like,
Guys,
yeah.
you need to do something about your social media algorithms if it's bringing you to Middletown Township content. If you're going to doom scroll, I want you to watch sports highlights, funny videos, dogs, not local government. I want that for you.
Well, I get two screens going. I got corgis jumping through the snow on my one screen, and the other screen
Okay,
I got some deep Middletown Township budget talk, and that's the stimuli that I need to get me going. But
I love small little dogs in deep snow. I have to be. I do.
you
I don't
can't
have
go
small
wrong.
dogs. I have large dogs, but you can't defeat it. You can't defeat
just
it.
right. That is, to me, if that's gonna rot my brain and take away all the intellectual thought capacity I have, okay, that's a good way to go. I'm cool with that.
I love that for you. That's amazing.
I see it as a reprieve, so to speak, because everything's connected to all our, Amazon and smart systems at home. And, having three little ones, my feed is often populated with the whole 6-7 nonsense. So,
I cannot
Yeah.
relate to that. I cannot relate. No.
it's so bad. I went in late the other day, just taking my little one to school. And, apparently there's just a mob of kids outside the school that just wait for bus 67 just
Oh,
because, right? And it's
I'm
a daily
so out
ritual.
of touch. I'm so not trendy. This is something
So
I don't
I
even know
say
what
that
to
to
say.
say when
you shouldn't
government stuff
lament not
comes up,
being a part of this trend. That's
Okay,
one that
good.
you
I'm not
can-
missing anything.
you
Yeah,
are
you're
not
definitely
missing
not
anything.
missing anything.
So
Yeah.
So, guys,
I
I
see
know.
that as a reprieve when I see government stuff.
Oh, there you go. So, speaking of government stuff, not really. So, I know Dave's got a great episode packed for us today, which I'm super excited about. But before we get started, I have a question for you guys. This is our 7th episode, I think, which is still astounding to me. I'm still shocked when I look down at my phone and it says a new episode of Generation on the Rise has been published. And I'm a Spotify person, by the way. So, it comes up on my Spotify. And I'm like, oh, Generation on the, oh yeah, that's us. That's our podcast, right? That's Dave, Brandon, and Eden. And I'm still shocked. But it got me thinking, and I wanted to ask you guys too, because I think there's quite a few people listening to this, which is astounding to me. Our friends, our families, people we know, our colleagues, people we don't know, people we wish we knew, people out in the universe. I think they have a question, and I'm sort of reflecting on this question. Why did we name this podcast Generation on the Rise? I know we all talked about it, we all agreed to it, but why was that the name?
Yeah, I could take, or at least
Yeah,
start
man.
this one, because I will claim ownership for the most part. We all claim a little bit of ownership, right? But
But it was your brainchild, right?
I will say it's one of my brainchildren, right?
It's my
And it's really
brainchildren.
just
Brainchildren.
brainchildren, right? It really just started as a conversation, as most great things do, right? It really started in a conversation with some student, aspirational professionals, right? Like people who are wanting to get into profession. And as you guys and some of our listeners know, back when I did my graduate degree, I was very involved in the local ICMA student chapter. And I attribute a lot of my involvement in my career progression to that early start and the connections I built through them. And I've tried to play that forward, right? Not only here, but as I hit the road with ICMA and, whether it's New York, when I, saw Dave when he was up there, or Arizona or wherever, even Florida, right? We were just in Tampa, connecting with the student chapters and some of the younger professionals in the room. And one of the resounding things I've heard coming from them, and it's been pretty universal, which has been surprising but not surprising at the same time, is that they feel not connected. They don't feel engaged. And one of the reasons for me, started this podcast and really named it Generation on the Rise, which I supported from the get-go, was really making them feel included, right? Not necessarily excluding, people of our age and, our forefathers and, forebears, right? But really making that perception that they are included, that, these aspirational professionals, whether they just got into the field or they're a student trying to get into the field, that this podcast is geared towards them and that they are included in the conversation.
That's really interesting. And while I don't necessarily disagree with everything you said, I'm not sure that I identify with it in terms of why we named this podcast that Generation on the Right. Dave, what I mean,
Yeah. No,
thoughts?
I mean, I like that. I mean, I think Brandon, I think the connotation is right. I mean, we're thinking of generation on the rise right away. Your mind goes to, the next generation of leadership, those that are getting out of grad school, maybe still in grad school, maybe still working on their undergrad, whatever they may be, but they haven't quite gotten that first job in local government. Maybe they're still deciding on their path. So I agree with Brandon in a sense that there is a little bit of like, find my identity. How do we get worked into the fold? When I think generation on the rise, that is partly where my mind goes to. But I've always struggled with, kind of like couching generations with like a start and an end date. Like you've got this cohort of leadership and, they were the ones that are in grad school to the first 5 years of their career. And then you got 5 to 10, and then you got 11 plus or whatever you might like, because I don't think we really operate like that in our professions and in our day to day. We have to interact with people from all stages of their careers at all ages with all levels of expertise and background and history. I think of the generations that are on the rise as kind of encompassing all of that. And really what we're rising into is not so much like another generation of leadership or young leaders coming into roles in government, so much as we are tackling new challenges that historically we haven't been involved in as government agencies. A lot of that seismic shift that we're seeing in our communities today, when we're talking about things that 10, 15, 20 years ago would never have risen to our agendas and to, our elected officials' radar. I think that's that generational shift, and it includes everybody at all stages in their career, but it's about the new challenges and new things that we're trying to tackle collectively. How about you?
So I like that too, but that's not where my mind has gone.
Ooh, man.
Enlighten
When I
us.
think of, so my thought is when I think generation on the rise, I mean, let's be candid, right? This is a podcast of three still young professionals who are working in local government. We are still young managers. Like there is still so much that we are going to experience if we stay in this field, things that we're going to go through, things we haven't learned, haven't experienced. Like the majority of our careers are in front of us, not behind us by a long shot. When I think generation on the rise, I just think the youngest generation, the younger generation is getting older. And we have some experiences, we will have more, but we are opinionated because we've been in the field, right? We're challenging some of the norms that have been in this field. And eventually, in time, we will be the oldest generation in this field. But right now, the younger generation is not as young as we once were. We are getting older and we have opinions and we have this interest in sharing it. But I think it's to me, it's that simple, right? It's this young generation is sharing information. And when I reflected upon that, I thought to myself, wow, that's very interesting that we think that we have this interest in sharing information and have decided to get together weekly and record us talking about a topic and our opinions for an hour and share that with our colleagues. But the other side of it is we're deeply privileged to be able to do that, right? In many respects, the older generation has paved the way for us to be able to do that, right? Like our mentors, the leaders in this field who have been doing this longer than some of us have been alive. Like we owe it to them. Like in many respects, we're standing on the shoulders of giants who have paved the way. So when I think
Yeah, I
of
mean, I
generation
think
on the
you,
rise,
I
that's
think
sort of
that's
my mindset.
It's definitely well said. I mean, I think it's a good segue too into our topic because, I don't want to introduce it. I don't want to spoil it yet, but I think there's definitely relevance in all of that to the topic of this episode. And I don't think anything you said was in opposition to what Brandon or I said. Maybe it's kind of an umbrella over top of it because I think you really contextualize it well. And it'd be interesting to hear from the listening audience, from the people out there in that are tuning into our show. Use get on Substack. I know there's an engagement way there where you could tell us, what do you think of when you think of generation on the rise? What does that elicit? Tell you what do you guys think? Let's get started.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's make it happen.
All right. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another exciting installment of Generation on the Rise. This is the podcast where we are talking about all things facing local government, and we are doing so through the lens of that generation on the rise, that up and coming generation, or depending on how you look at it, the generation that's been in the workforce and is setting the stage for those to come. I'm going to get right into our topic, but before I do, I'd love to introduce the crew that's with me today behind the scenes. Playing the role of our very own Dr. Dre is our producer, Nancy Hess of NJ Hess Associates, which means that I am joined on screen by Easy E, Eden Ratliff of Middletown Township in Bucks County, and of course, the Ice Cube of Lower Marion Township. He's Mr. Brandon Ford, and I will be your MC Ren for the day, your host du jour, Dave Probolka from Bellefonte Borough and Keystone Municipal Solutions. Going to get right at it, but before I do, as always, I just want to remind our listening audience that the opinions and viewpoints you hear from us just belong to us and us alone, and do not necessarily reflect those of the great municipalities and organizations for which we are employed, nor do they necessarily reflect those of the professional consortiums with which we are affiliated, like ICMA, APMM, PML, NLC, MS4, and of course the Burger King Kids Club. So guys, let's jump right into the subject today, which is going to be talking about bias. All kinds of biases is a huge topic. I can't wait to get your perspective on it. Probably could talk about this for hours and on end, but we're going to really hit some of the fine points. Let's take it right from the top and I want to get your thoughts on how you define bias, or maybe more appropriately, how does it define you? Eden, why don't you start with that? Tell us about what bias means in your life.
Dave, this is going to be a great episode with some really hard-hitting questions that are challenging to answer. I think when I think of bias, like we all, whether we realize it or not, are looking at the world through our own lens, and everyone's lens is different, right? It's colored by our experiences, how we've gone through the world, how our parents brought us to the world, what our upbringing was like, sort of the privilege that we may or may not have had in different scenarios. All of these things sort of factor in and create a blueprint of who we are and how we approach the world. And I think bias is inherent. I think everyone has bias. I think to try to eliminate any sort of organization, any sort of situation of bias is incredibly difficult to do. I know I try to approach the world knowing that I have bias and to ensure that I have systems and a team around me that can influence us, and just sort of be aware that the perspectives that they're bringing are different and are true, and that we need to take that into consideration as we do the work that we do, and ensure that we sort of have a call out culture where we can sort of recognize, how we might engage in sort of linear thinking or linear doing, without the sort of influences of the outside perspectives who bring, something to the table that maybe that we don't. And I try to look around the tables that we're at and figure out, well, what's missing, right? What perspectives are missing? What experiences are missing? What part of our communities are not represented here? And ensure that there's a place for everybody, so that the work that we can do is equitable and that everyone can sort of find their place in it.
Right? Yeah, definitely. A lot of great points there. I want to, kind of get to later in the episode what you mean by, I think you touched on a really good subject, which is whether we want to reduce or eliminate it, or whether we want to be mindful of its existence and kind of utilize it like a tool, like any other tool that we have at our disposal. But Brandon, what are your thoughts on this?
I think Easy E, which I will now keep forever, Eden. So
I hope that doesn't stick.
Nah, I don't think it's going to stick.
No. Maybe I'll just keep it for, in my pocket.
For when you need it. Yeah, bust that out.
But I think Eden kind of outlines it very well, this issue of bias. But I'd like to, for, the listeners who might not be in the, the workplace, or boil it down a little bit further. But for me, biases could be advantageous or, not advantageous, right? It's those advantages or disadvantages that occur for one reason or another, whether it's organizational culture, whether it's, existing practice. It's those disadvantages or those advantages that's one or an organization experiences for one reason or another. And I think Eden referenced it, but I just want to call it out plainly. Bias occurs, right? Whether intentional, which, we all strive to not have intentional bias in our lives, but some of it is unintentional, right? Some of it is just environmental that we have limited control over, whether it's because it's a, practice like redlining that occurred, decades ago, or for some other reason. So I think we just need to call it out plain and simple. Bias happens, right? For one reason or another, whether we intend it to happen or not.
Yeah, definitely. I like that we've been talking about bias as, sort of just in its simplest form. It's a tendency of ours. I mean, it's a tendency to favor one outcome over another. It's a tendency to gravitate toward a school of thought versus another. It really is. I mean, if you look up, and there's a whole litany of different kinds of biases that have been studied. up and down over the course of many years. But they all the definitions almost start with the tendency to,
Yeah.
or whatever, is some kind of iteration of that. Like I think you both touched on, these are things that are in many cases instinctual. I mean, they're things that we were born with. They're coded in our DNA. Others are things that we've learned. They're a collective product of our lived experiences and how we've been influenced by our mentors and our parents and our siblings and the environment that we grew up in. And that might be good, bad, or indifferent. But I think when you boil it down to its simplest form, it really is just a tendency to favor one outcome over another. All of the schools of thought and disciplines that have followed suit have really been just an extension of that very basic premise. So why don't we start by taking it from the top? And
Can I
when
tell
it
you a
comes
story
to,
real quick?
yeah, please.
Love stories.
Yeah. So I used to be the deputy city manager in the city of Charlottesville, Virginia. And so my first city council meeting there, I noticed at the beginning of the meeting that the city council didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. Do you guys say the Pledge of Allegiance before your board meetings?
Yeah.
Brandon? Yeah.
Only our board meetings, not our committee meetings.
Sure, only your board meetings. So they didn't. And I thought, oh, I didn't know what to think of it. So I said to
Okay.
my colleague, who is a woman of color, I said, who had been working there for quite a few years, I said, do we not say the Pledge of Allegiance here? And she sort of looked at me strangely. She said, no, absolutely not.
Huh.
Not in this city. I said, well, why? And she said, well, there's quite a few people in this city who don't believe that this country was built for them and don't feel like they have a place or didn't have an original place in this country when it was founded, by our founding fathers. Of course, the city of Charlottesville was founded by Thomas Jefferson, who's one of the founding fathers of this country, and Charlottesville was his, right? I mean, there's many things in Charlottesville where Thomas Jefferson is still felt. I mean, people talk about Thomas Jefferson as if he is still walking amongst the streets of Charlottesville. He's
Really?
obviously not, but they talk about it. And she said, yeah, there's a lot of people here, whether they're descendants of slaves or whether they're descendants of founding fathers, but they were enslaved because of the color of their skin, meaning we had founding fathers who were engaging in intercourse with their enslaved peoples. So they said, that this country was not necessarily founded for them. And so they don't say the Pledge of Allegiance there. And I mean, that makes complete sense, that explanation, but I was shocked in the moment. I'd never experienced or thought about it. Right. And so
Yeah.
I just wonder, how many governments have I been a part of where no one on the team or maybe on the governing body or in, the community thinks like that. And we're just biased towards our experiences, our upbringing, our privilege, but not everyone who we're serving is. So I just thought that maybe that was sort of a relevant story to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, Brandon, what about you? Do you do the pledge you said you do at council meetings, but not at
At our board meetings,
committee
the
meetings?
fun thing with Lower Merion, we meet almost every Wednesday, with only one being
yeah.
a
Committee
board
of the
meeting.
whole, right?
Yep, committees of the whole, which honestly, lets us get more stuff done and makes our meetings that much shorter, right? Except for when
But like
a
I'd never
certain
worked
topic comes up.
anywhere.
But
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that would definitely catch my eye. I mean, that, because I can't think of a time when my governing body didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance, but it was never in a situation, I was never in an environment like what you're describing, a community that had, that history that you're talking about. And I think that is, kind of just another, check in the box of the fact that, bias is, a product of our lived experience. I mean, they obviously have a very different perception of what the Pledge of Allegiance means to them and have opted to, kind of put that on the shelf because, of bringing the kind of history that it denotes and the feelings it invokes. And then there's so much nuance to this. And I do want to get right into it, start from the top, which is really talking about bias in our hiring processes. And there's been a body of work that's looked at this. I want to ask you, Brandon, first. I mean, if you and the manager at Lower Merion Township, if you've employed techniques to control bias during the screening of candidates, like there's blind resume reviews, there's diverse interview panels, and if so, do you think that it's been successful, and is there any downside to it?
Got to think on that one. Now, we don't do blind resume reviews. That is one thing that we haven't tried yet, but we often employ, very robust interview panels, right? Like it's not just a singular department interviewing for, a said position. We often make sure that there are multiple people in the room. of various degrees to make sure that we limit the bias, right? Like, as I was saying, bias occurs and oftentimes can never be guaranteed to be eliminated, right? So we often strive to reduce, the occurrence or the likelihood of it. So I'll give you a perfect example, my story, right? Laura Marion just hired, right, like earlier last year, a new superintendent, a new police superintendent, right? So understanding that this position was going to be very, public, right? It was going to be very, one of those very important hires, right? Like next to the manager who is in charge of your police department is right up there in terms of, public facing hires. We really made a robust effort to include a lot of voices into the process, right? We did numerous focus groups with our board. We had focus groups with our resident community, making sure that various aspects, not only geographical, but also socioeconomic and cultural voices were represented in those focus groups. And also when we did the actual interviews, right, we not only included management and a select number of our board members in HR, but we also included fellow department heads, a few of them, as well as people or representatives from the rank and file of the police force, right? To broaden that net, make sure a lot of voices are heard so that when a recommendation came forward, we can say, hey, we've heard from all these different groups, all these different peoples, all these different perspectives and viewpoints. And we heard quite a gambit of different perspectives, right? It wasn't, hey, we want to focus on X. It was pretty much a laundry list of what they wanted to see in their new superintendent. So, that's how we've gone about doing it.
That's interesting because I think about that a lot, and I've done something similar. Maybe you have too, Eden, but what I always come back to is, okay, is it better to have one or two people in an interview process and understand that their bias is going to affect their hiring decisions and their perspective on a candidate, or have 15 people and all of their bias affecting how they perceive a candidate? Like, I guess it just introduces another question of, do you control bias by adding more perspective to a process, or does it exacerbate bias by creating more of a kind of conflicting and difficult sort of nebulous cloud of a bunch of different lived experiences like that? But Eden, what do you think? Or what do you do?
I think controlling bias is challenging, but I think the process starts before we're even at the interview panel. Like, what does the job description really say? Is it
Right.
written for the duties? Are we putting requirements in there that aren't necessary for the position? For example, like, how many jobs do we say things like master's degree preferred, where you
Right.
absolutely don't need a master's degree? Same thing with a bachelor's degree. Previous experience in local government required. Well, it's hard to get into local government. It's hard to, get certain roles in local government. Do we really need that, or can we teach it? I mean, how many of those situations are playing out? I think about some of our other practices, residency requirements, right? How many people are we eliminating because they're not able to pick up their life and relocate because maybe they don't have the financial means to do that, or a family situation to be able to do that, to get there, right? I have a collective bargaining agreement here that says to work in public works, you have to live within the township. Do you know how expensive a house is in Middletown Township? Right? Like, how many people are we eliminating, from the
Right.
overall career ladder because they can't, rent or buy a house in Middletown, right?
So
I mean,
you
maybe
you currently have a residency requirement for public works?
that's right. It's in the collective bargaining agreement. Yep. Now,
I
whether or
Not
not that's
uncommon, by the
enforced
way.
is a different question. Whether or not we're actually applying that, I don't know. But it's in the contract. It says it. So at one point in time, theoretically, that was enforced. I mean,
Yeah.
how many? And so maybe people say, well, that's good. We're helping the township, by getting township residents. Okay, well, what about somebody else, right, who can't afford to live here?
Yeah, I'm gonna go on my
It's
soapbox
Right.
just a little bit.
like
Residency requirements, right? Like,
we could have a whole episode
I
on
We
know.
could
residency
do an episode
requirements.
and should.
Yeah, I
It's
Yes.
mean, we probably
just
should. Yeah.
so it artificially shrinks the pool, right? Like, I get the
I mean, how many
motivations
people of
for it,
color am I
but
eliminating applying for this position in public works? I mean,
Exactly.
Middletown's a predominantly white community. I mean, there's no two ways about it. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just by
I
that
mean,
simple requirement. I'm sorry, Brandon. I didn't mean to cut
no,
you off
no, no,
there.
no. You probably saved me from myself a little bit, Eden. So thanks. Nothing gets me
bring in a
riled
life
up as
preserver.
much as residency requirements, right? Because being so
Um,
close to Philadelphia, we've seen it. Like Philadelphia,
yeah,
I have a really good friend. He was in my wedding and all that, who works for the city, and he has to move into the city.
Yeah.
and he works in the
Hmm.
justice system over there, and he has to reside in Philadelphia, right? Now,
Yeah.
it wasn't as much of a deal when we were both young bachelors, but now both of us have families. Obviously, I don't live in the city; I live in the burbs with a
The
very good
burbs.
school district for my three kiddos. But he now has a little one of his own, and the question is, like, what do you do, right? Do you pay
Right.
the extra? Do you have enroll in a school district, which people have strong feelings about the Philadelphia school district, right? Being a champion of public school myself, do you enroll in a private school, or do you move out and you switch jobs to get into a suburban school district, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To get back onto the
Yeah.
question that Dave asked, right? I am a fan of blind reviews of applications. So, what I'm accustomed to is assigning someone within HR or someone within the organization to receive applications, and they have to black out a lot of information, right? Their name, date of birth, where they live,
They
schools they
live.
attended, like basically any information that we don't need in order to determine whether or not, they merit an interview, right? Because there's bias in all of those things. Like I don't need to know whether or not you attended a state system school in Pennsylvania or whether or not you attended George Washington University. There's bias in that. So I am accustomed to that. I think
Yeah.
when I think about panels, Dave, you brought up a good point. Like, do you want the bias of 2 people or 15 people? I tend to try to look at the panel. Does my panel look like my community? Does it look like my team? Do they all look the
Right.
same, sound the same? Like,
Position of the panel matters, right?
right. It matters a lot. Is there diversity in thought there? Racial diversity, cultural diversity. Like these things are super important.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I mean, it was kind of a devil's advocate question because I think you're exactly right. We know we can't, there's no better solution. You're not going to find an interview panel that is free of bias. So your best option is to make sure that that panel emulates the community, emulates the workforce, emulates the work culture, and understanding that they're going to have to exist in this paradigm too of bias, and they meaning the applicant and candidate, and they're going to have their own bias to bring to the
Right.
fold as well. So how does that integrate as part of that overall process? But I think when we think about bias in hiring, racial and gender bias do tend to dominate the bandwidth on that subject. And I certainly can understand why, but there's other kinds of biases that I think are also impactful in the hiring process. And one of those is affinity bias. I mean, again, getting back to tendencies, this is our tendency to favor like minded individuals over those that have divergent viewpoints and backgrounds. So, I can tell you from experience that I've surrounded myself with dissenting viewpoints, and that's not without consequence either. Eden, I'm curious, what's your take on this bias and tendency? And do you think we should be working to overcome this in hiring? And how do we?
Yeah, it freaks me out when I'm in like a leadership team meeting or in a room where I like speak ideas or say things and people go, "That's a great idea. We should do that." I'm like, "Okay, well, can someone please disagree with me? Like I don't have a monopoly on good ideas. I have lots of bad ideas actually. Some of them are good. Like, I need the brainstorming. I need the diversity of thought. I need people to challenge me, challenge our team, challenge what we're doing. It concerns me a lot, that we just start hiring people who think like we do because we can get we're missing things, right? We're missing the
Mhm.
perspective of the community. We're missing like portions of the community that need to be represented, that need to be served if we're all thinking alike. That's one thing. And then two, like you get yourself into a rut, right? Like if you're not challenging yourself, if you're not trying to do things differently, if you're not reaching, to make sure that you're continuously trying to enhance the services that you're providing, like you're going to get into a rut and you're going to miss things that way too, which can create this sort of underservice or, again, missing certain things, certain groups of people, whatever. So I'm always looking for people who are qualified and can challenge the way we do things. And in addition to that, trying to create a culture of challenge, right? Where it's perfectly acceptable to say, I'm not sure about that. I disagree about that. Have you thought about doing it this way? Have we tried this, right? Where we're critiquing each other and critiquing ourselves to ensure that we're trying to, put out the best product and ideas that we can.
Yeah, and that does even introduce another bias, which we maybe can get into in part two of this series, which is groupthink. And you get people around the table talking about a subject, and how do you create an environment that's conducive to challenging ideas that come from that environment? It's very difficult, and there's a whole litany of examples that we could get into where groupthink has had some really traumatic consequences. There's a famous example around Pearl Harbor where everyone, really was kind of everyone that really had an opportunity to, get the intel on this sort of expected this attack. and yet there was a kind of a famous meeting of high ranking military officials where nobody wanted to challenge the
The conventional
prevailing
thought, right?
wisdom, yeah, the conventional thought that they were untouchable in that base and that they weren't, susceptible to any kind of enemy attack. And of course, the consequences of that were, are etched in history. Brandon, how about you? How do you, when you think about team building and this notion of affinity bias, what kind of premium do you put on that, surrounding your room with like-minded individuals or individuals that have different perspectives on things?
I always welcome dissenting opinions, right? Like I always tell, a lot of members of my staff, there are no dumb questions. Questions are always welcomed, even, in the manager's office, right? If you don't see something eye to eye, please disagree with us. We're begging for you to disagree with us and critique, an instruction or a thought that we've put out into the organization. And I often play the role of poking the bear a little bit. When there is perceived groupthink going on, especially among our department heads. If someone comes up with an idea, and we usually use those our senior staff meetings, which we do every month. If there's a big project that one of the departments is working on, we'll put it to the full group, right? And if I'm not perceiving as much engagement as I think we should have, I'll start asking questions. Like we just redid our student rental regulations, and I was like, parking services. Do our students take out parking permits? Oh yeah, well yeah they do. It's like, well, how does this rental regulations impact parking services, right? And kind of just offering that little bit of a starting point really opened up the door a little bit. And I will say, that generated a few other conversations about, how do we tie student parking permits to where, they are citing on their permits for licenses for trying to catch some of those not so permitted student rentals that we often encounter for those town and gown communities.
So, Eden, what about the CAO assistant CAO relationship? I mean, this bias, I think, is something that it really injects itself into that dynamic. You either want somebody who's going to challenge your worldview on everything, or and in that case, probably makes things very difficult for you, or do you want somebody who's going to kind of be an extension in some respects of your own philosophies on leadership and organizational management, or is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, challenge me, right? Challenge me, make sure that we're, not just getting stuck, in groupthink ourselves, that we're thinking about the whole of the community, the whole of the team that we're serving. I want some assurances that when we're on the same page, we've really beat up whatever it is we're talking about. And are coming at it from sort of as many different angles as we possibly can, and are inviting the broader team into that process too. I really don't want like the yes person that comes into my office, like, yeah, great idea, boss, let's do it. I'd rather be like, have you thought about that? That's sort of unhinged. I'm not sure we should do that, and sort of, make sure that we're pressure testing, what we have. That's my perspective. I'd rather it be difficult with some degree of assurance that we're sort of on the right path to getting to the right place. I say to my team and, to my assistant all the time, I don't have a monopoly on good ideas. I like to brainstorm and kick things around. And, we're getting to the point in our careers where we can sort of reflect on things that we've done in other municipalities. And sometimes we get lost in the assumption that what we did previously will work in a new place, which is not always
Mm,
true.
right.
So I want to pressure test things there too. I'd rather take the long way around the block to make sure we get to the destination we're trying to get to.
See, let me jump in, Dave, just for a
Yeah, go
second,
ahead.
because I don't entirely agree with Eden, right? We think a lot
Wow.
alike oftentimes, but, I think there's a happy medium here, right? Like, personally, I don't want someone that is going to be, completely challenging every single thing that is said to them, right? Like, I think there's a happy medium. It could be like, okay, I see, I don't want a yes person by any means, right? But I could see trouble on the horizon if you have, whether you're a CAO and a deputy or assistant, that they are so diametrically opposed, right? That they just don't see eye to eye on anything. I think there's
Okay, hold on. That's not exactly what I was trying to communicate. Right.
Right.
So like we want the same thing, right? Like we want to make sure we're delivering first-rate services for our community, that we are doing so transparently, that we have a robust process where it can be influenced by everyone it needs to be
yeah,
influenced by, that we're delivering options to the governing body where appropriate. My perspective is like I don't want to just sit in my office by myself and decide the entire process as to how we're going to do something and then communicate it to the team and to my assistant and then say, great idea, I'll execute. Right.
gotcha,
Like I want to
gotcha.
make sure, that we're challenging what we're doing, that we're going through that sort of like brainstorming process together, that we're considering all angles because we come to it with different perspectives and the broader team comes to it with different perspectives that I think can enhance, what we're proposing in the end. That's sort
Right.
of what I'm saying.
And
So it's not that we're challenging everything, right? Like it's we're climbing a mountain together. Like I need him, he needs me, we need the
It's
broader
truly a
team. It's not a
partnership,
one
right?
man show. Yeah, it's
I'll tell you
absolutely a
something
partnership.
that to your point, that's kind of that just a quick anecdote on that subject that's fascinating me. I mean, I've had the opportunity twice in my career to be an assistant CAO. One was coming into Ferguson Township, first job in government, assistant township manager, working in state college for a long tenured manager named Mark Kunkel. He and when I started in that role, he kind of made that same overture to me right away. Look, I'm not looking for somebody who's going to be an extension of myself, who's going to agree with all of my world. I'm bringing you in intentionally because you have a different perspective and you have, you're at a different stage in your career. But what like from my lens, first job in local government, it was very hard for me to come forward with that, level of vigor in defense of my perspective and opinions about things. I was coy about it. I was nervous about it. I wasn't sure if he was being genuine. And it resulted in kind of a dynamic, at least for those first few months and probably even first year or so, where I was kind of going along
Hmm.
and just about everything that came, I was nodding my head in agreement. Fast forward to the second time in my career, coming into Livingston County as deputy county administrator, working for a guy named Ian Coyle. I was at a different stage in my career. I had already been a manager for over 10 years. I was confident in some of my perspectives and opinions about things. He and I had a much more, I think, a cohesive relationship in the manner that you're describing, Eden, because I was just at a different juncture in my career at that point. Let's move on real quick, because I got another topic I want to bring up outside the hiring and team building kind of arena, but bias related. And Brandon, I want to ask you your perspective on this, because we were just talking about how you define generation on the rise and
Mhm.
some of our variations of what our opinions were to get out of this podcast. But another kind of bias that surrounds us, especially these days, is confirmation bias, and this is our kind of subconscious preference for facts and ideas that support our preconceived notions about the world around us. And conversely, our tendency to be dismissive of the facts,
Mhm.
opinions, and ideas that run contrary to those notions. I mean, think about this concept of tribalism that we all talk about and what we see in the media and play out in state and national politics, even down to the local level in some applications, and how that's affected the generation in the workforce and entering the workforce. We're probably more polarized societally than ever before, or at least there's more outlets to express that polarization. We feel more empowered to do it. So, Brandon, how do you see confirmation bias in the profession of municipal management impacting this and the next generation of leaders? And how is it different, if it is, from past generations? And how do we overcome that?
Well, like all these type of biases, it's a reality of the profession, right? Like it exists. To say it doesn't exist, is not entirely accurate. And regarding the idea of tribalism, I wholeheartedly agree, right? Like I think the tribalism that we are abundantly seeing, nowadays, has always existed. Just like bias, right? Humans are social creatures. We will always find our quote tribe. That's just, embedded in our psyche, whether we like it or not. And I always drum back to the middle school dances, right? Like, no matter what middle school you go to, if you go to a middle school dance, you'll walk into the gym or wherever the dance is at, and you'll see the boys on one side, the girls on the other, for the most part. Not unanimous, but for majority of the instances, you're going to see that, right? And I think you're going to see that too from a generational perspective, right? And we've talked about it in previous episodes where, you know, we're on this trend, at least I think so, where, you have some of the more conventional managers, those who have been in the profession for a longer period of time, who perceive, the proper role of what government should be doing, right? Like what government services are, what should be provided, what should be the scope of management, right? And you have this younger generation, the generation on the rise, right, coming into the profession with a unique perspective, right? Everyone brings their own unique experiences, but generally speaking, there is a trend for the most part among younger professionals or students that are coming in with a more enlarged version of local government and what government services should be provided. Like, look at affordable housing, right? Like, it is now becoming, a mainstream trend that for the most part, a lot of local governments are getting into that realm of ensuring affordable housing, which
So,
necessarily wasn't the case.
couple hot takes there, just to disagree a little bit. I don't think that the generational lines define the willingness to reconsider or challenge the role of municipal managers in local government. I think there are managers who've been doing this for a long time who are very willing and actively step back and challenge their role, the role that they have in their municipality and what their municipality needs from them and from the local government. Like there are some seasoned managers who are on the forefront of trying to engage in opportunities to create affordable housing, for
Mhm.
example, right? Like I don't think I don't think the quote unquote generation on the rise owns that at all. Actually, I think there are probably younger generational managers who aren't doing enough for whatever reason, in those veins, whereas some of the seasoned managers really are on the cutting edge of that. So I would just push back to, on the idea that that falls amongst generational lines because I don't think it does.
Yeah. Well, what's your take then on this, Eden? I mean, confirmation bias in the workforce as it pertains to the new generation of management, the existing generation, the existing, kind of cohort of managers out there. Are you concerned about it? Do you think it's something
Yeah,
that's just a
this
part of the?
worries me so much.
Yeah.
I'm constantly concerned because I'm pretty confident in myself, right? My ability to sort of consider different pieces of information, analyze
Right.
stuff. And I'm always concerned that I'm missing something. There's something I didn't think of. There's data I didn't analyze. There's a perspective that I didn't hear or didn't have the opportunity to hear. And that I'm just sort of saying, yeah, as I thought, this is the case. Let's move forward. I mean, this worries me. And so I try to make sure that I'm surrounded by a diversity of thought, by a diversity approach, with a diverse team that is, in that culture of challenge that I talked about earlier, ensuring, that we're considering our perspectives. And I try to remain open minded, right? Just because
Right.
I think something doesn't mean it's right. Just because I've experienced something doesn't mean that's the full story. Just because something worked in a different municipality doesn't mean that's appropriate for, where I find my 2 feet in that moment. So being open minded and then I think being data driven, but that's, worrisome too, right? I mean, you can be
Yeah.
engaging in confirmation bias when you're analyzing data also because there's tons of different data sets. There's quantitative and qualitative data that comes at you from different angles. So that worries me too. So I think just sort of being aware of it and ensuring that you're not the only person writing that story, I think is, a step in the right direction.
Yeah, you're so right. I remember like early in my career, I gave my capstone at APMM, Association of Pennsylvania Municipal Management in Bedford, and Nancy will remember this. And I don't remember. I don't know if any of you guys were around that here at the time, but I was talking about generations in management. I was talking about this exact subject, and I was pointing to all these data points that I had found in the lead up to my presentation that supported my hypothesis on it, which was really to suggest that there are, as I think I've continued throughout my career, that there are some nuanced differences about the generations in the workplace, but they're not quite as profound and stark as some people would like to think they are. But I had this data, I was armed with this data, and as I was developing this, I was doing just what you're describing. You can use data to put your thumb on the scale. There
Oh
is
yeah.
not, there is bias in data that it goes even to the collection of the data. I mean, how many of us have done community surveys in the past where there's really been not a whole lot of attention or focus given to the statistical significance of the data that we're collecting, the validity, the reliability of the questions. I mean, we are really, and we can't really be blamed for that. We're managers, we're local government, we're putting surveys out. Whoever responds, we're happy to get a response. We're not really in the business of, okay, what's the chi-square test of statistical significance on that. I don't think any of us
push
have.
back on that too, right?
Yeah, do you?
You know, down in Charlottesville, every other year they do a community survey and they push it out to,
Yep.
I'm gonna butcher the name of the office, but a special division of UVA who specializes in doing these types of scientifically backed surveys. And they sample a whole bunch of information and they give you sort of a scientific result. They tell you within how many standard deviation points, you know, a certain finding, the confidence level of that finding.
Sure.
I mean, it's a proper scientific survey that I think we're used to in the world of academia, and that's what they rely on, right? I mean, it's a very professional operation.
Yeah, but
But I would argue that that's more the exception than the norm, don't you think? I mean, how many of us in Pennsylvania
I don't
municipalities that do community surveys are going to that level of analytics?
So this
Maybe
is
I'm
your
wrong,
this is
but
our this is yeah, maybe you are, right? This is the bias of our thought, right? I mean, our experiences, which are limited, which are
Mhm.
primarily here in Pennsylvania, tell us one thing, but I can't speak to what's happening in municipalities and cities that are larger, you know, across the country. I'm not sure what the norm is, and I don't want to just get caught in this idea of, well, I don't know any municipality. And I'm not saying you're
well,
doing this,
and I
Dave.
mean, I was really
You know,
using it to illustrate my anecdote of how I was, you know, kind of utilizing that data. But I do think that that bias in data collection, you know, goes well beyond just, you know, those individual experiences in smaller municipalities.
but I think
However,
this is where, you know, the generation on the rise and our willingness to sort of go there and challenge things, right? Like I think we're the type of people who will look at something and say, okay, well maybe a Facebook survey or maybe a survey monkey from my municipality about whatever is not the way to go. Can I get into and rely on sort of my educational background? Can we do a scientific survey? How are other municipalities across state boundaries engaging in this in order to collect accurate information and inform the governing and managing process in a municipality? One of the things that Brandon talks about a lot, and I am in lockstep with him about, is how important it is for us as managers to engage with other managers outside of our immediate area, not just focusing on our state association, but talking to municipalities across the country, utilizing ICMA to have a broader network, because there are both good and bad ideas happening throughout the country and throughout the world, to be honest, that we can apply locally. This is a great example of that, right? If we only looked at Pennsylvania municipalities, we may say, well, you know, most surveys are, you know, super biased because they're unsophisticated and unscientific. But when we go just a few hundred miles further, we realize there's a completely different and much more robust way to collect information. So just to like make a point about the importance of sort of engaging in a national network, you know, the way
Yeah.
that we have in previous episodes, you know, I think this is just an example of that.
Do you want to do an
Yeah,
ad
no, I'd be-
campaign for ICMA, Eden?
I don't want to do an ad campaign. I did record one time back in Milwaukee, actually. I recorded a little snippet of the value of ICMA and how
I did see
important
that.
it is to the profession and to developing and training managers, and how that's a cornerstone of effective government and how that plays into democracy. You know, so ICMA is certainly willing to, you know, they have my permission to use the things that I say because I believe them
And
wholeheartedly.
let me build
well,
on
we
that
need to,
just a
we need
little
to hear
bit.
from our listeners on that too. I mean, what are you doing? Am I all wet on this issue? And I'll be the first to put my foot in my mouth. It'd be surprising to me if Pennsylvania was anomalous in the sense that, like, you know, everybody else is doing these statistically valid samples and surveys of their communities when they're trying to assess political sentiment on an issue, and we're the, you know, kind of outlier here that are just kind of getting the data that we can get and being happy that we get the data we can get. And like I said, you know, maybe that's not accurate, but you know, the prospect of confirmation bias concerns me a great deal. I think, you know, when you think about the influences that we have that were not present in our society even 10, 15 years ago, this AI driven algorithmic content control system that gives us information that feeds the meter and only amplifies our sentiment on a subject, we are relying heavily on ourselves and those that are on our teams and in our organizations to be able to recognize that that is not the only worldview and that's not the only perspective, and that it is influenced on any side of the political spectrum, on any sides of a particular issue, by the people that and the institutions that want us to continue to think in a certain way. So conspiratorial, I don't know, maybe a little bit, but I think that there is some real heavy influences on our perception of the world around us that just didn't exist even a few short years ago. Brandon, discuss.
I'm going to take this and kind of microscope it a little bit. Do we think
I can't believe it.
I know, right? Do we think, you know, this also applies to those managers who have only ever worked for, let's say, and I'm going to put myself in the range, right?
I was going to say, I think Dave and I on this podcast are the journeymen here.
Yeah, like I've only ever worked in
Just going to remind you of that.
right?
Right.
Like Dave, you've been in New York, you know, Eden, you've been in Virginia, and you've all come back home, back to where you belong in Pennsylvania, right? And we're
The
happy to
welcome
have
mat
you.
never looked more sweet.
But, we've all, worked for multiple municipalities, right? Like, I'm on my third, they've all varied in size and complexity, right? Lower Merion being the largest and most complex of the municipalities I've worked for. Do you think there is a bias out there for individuals who have ever only worked for a single municipality or have only ever worked for, like me, example, in a single state?
Yeah, this is a thing in Arizona. Arizona municipalities seem to think, and maybe someday we'll get a guest of a manager from Arizona to tell me I'm right or I'm wrong. I think there's a thing in Arizona that's like you can only manage in Arizona if you've managed in Arizona before, which is like
Yeah.
sort of crazy because if you start to study
If you think that
the
about that makes your head explode, right?
I know. Well, if you start to study the regulations in Arizona, Arizona is like a 21st century state when it comes to running their cities. Like it is, I think, you always have like the tendency to think the grass is greener on the other side. But there are so many like handcuffs and regulations we have here in Pennsylvania that wouldn't even be thought or heard of in Arizona. Like in many ways, it is very progressive where the cities have the, you know, enabling are enabled to like manage their city and run their city in a professional way. They have tons of different taxing options. There's all sorts of like regulations that don't exist where they can serve their communities from like end to end the way that their communities need to be served. Whereas in
Yes.
Pennsylvania, very complicated. The municipal laws here are very complicated. There's tons of layers of government, as we know, where it becomes super challenging. So I think recruiters, especially regional recruiters and governing bodies sometimes fall into this, I don't want to say trap, but fall into like this perspective that, well, we really are looking for Pennsylvania experience. We
Mhm.
really are looking for Arizona experience. When any sort of like effective manager can rely on the team that they inherit, their ability to do research and just sort of apply general management practices to wherever they go in order to continue, professional management. Do I think that there is an advantage to sort of coming in and knowing the municipal codes and sort of how things work? Yeah, of course there is, right? Like, I had a lot of catch up to do when I got to Charlottesville in Virginia, because Virginia regulations in an independent city like Charlottesville are completely different. So there's things you need to learn, but I can learn that, right? Like, we can figure that out, as we go, but admittedly coming back to Pennsylvania, I'm like, yeah, I know what the second class township code. I know what the, municipalities planning code says. I know how all these things work. And you sort of, just keep rolling, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think
Right.
further in that, we had the same sort of stickiness around, do you have to have been a manager before you become a manager, right?
Right.
Like we see folks coming from private industry, coming from the military, coming from nonprofits who are applying and, earning, these manager roles around the country. And I admit, sometimes I'm sort of like, that's interesting. How's that going to play out? Sometimes it plays out great. Sometimes it doesn't. Do I think there's a place for all of them on these teams? Of course. But it is sort of it's sort of a thing, to think
We're
about.
getting to the end of the hour here, but I really just I want to touch briefly on bias and how it influences the formation of public policy. So to kind of shift the burden from the managers and staff onto our elected officials a little bit. And we certainly understand they have a lot of different motivations of why they run for office. And, I don't think any of us generally care what the motivation is for an elected official to run for office as much as we care that they do want to run and they do want to serve the community, and we're appreciative and we are humbled by their commitment to that level of public service. But we can't ignore the influence that those forms of biases have on how they operate and how they make their decisions. Something that's always fascinated me is this proverbial squeaky wheel kind of thing, right? You might get a room full of, maybe there's 200 residents who feel one way about a particular issue. But the question is always, is that really reflective of the society, of the community at large? What about those that didn't come out and speak? Is that indicative that they're content with the status quo, or is it not enough to make a decision? And if not, how does an elected official kind of navigate that complexity? How do you tune out the voices of the 200 people that are right in front of your face and take a step back and try to get a more objective lens to decide how you formulate public policies? So, Brandon, I mean, what do you think? I mean, discuss, I guess.
You
What are
know,
your thoughts
it,
on that?
I've been in, somewhat unique situation because I'm technically an elected official on the ICMA board, right? Like my peers, my colleagues have elected me to serve on this governing body for ICMA. And, for anyone who's been an ICMA member has known that, we've had, boy, have we had a year, right? And we've heard quite a bit from our members, ICMA members, that, whether they are happy, unhappy, this is why they're unhappy. And, a lot of squeaky wheels over the course of last year. And one of the things that we have to do, and I think it's easier for us as a governing body that is composed of managers, right? Like we kind of get to see, and we have a little bit of a leg up on trying to tackle that and really making a concerted effort to make sure that the squeaky wheels aren't the only wheels that are being heard, and that for every squeaky wheel, there are, a multitude of other wheels that are working seamlessly, that are quiet, or maybe not working, but are quiet nonetheless. And, one of the things that I've done specifically representing the Northeast on the ICMA board is I've made a concerted effort to engage those voices that I haven't heard from. Like, yeah, sure, I know the ones that come up to me and make their feelings heard, but I will approach folks. You might have seen me in New York, Dave, kind of doing that to certain members that I've never heard from before, but I wanted to engage their opinion.
Social butterfly, you are. Eden, how about you?
So one of the things I'll tell a story, I guess, in how I think about this. So we have communities around the country that are prioritizing and going out of their way to enhance bike friendly, pedestrian friendly, scooter friendly transportation, right? We have communities that are shutting down roads sometimes, creating pedestrian malls. We have people, communities that are, creating one-way roads where there used to be two-lane roads or highways, where they're really prioritizing and making it difficult to have vehicles, to use vehicles, making parking regulations or eliminating parking, things that I think, by the way, are good. Like I'm not necessarily identifying a problem with all that, but we are shifting from some communities are shifting from a car-centric society to sort of multimodal transportation-centric society, which I'm supportive of. We have some communities that are going very far where they're trying to incentivize or make it more difficult for you to acquire a vehicle because they want you to utilize, different forms of transportation. And there are a ton of reasons, why they get behind this. All good. I think if we went to ICMA and we talked about this, many of our colleagues would say that they're doing this, that they agree with it, and they would list all sorts of benefits. Okay, great. Here's my question. Have you ever given thought to how a car is a tool towards wealth building? I would venture to bet all three of us drive to work and we don't even think about it, right? Like I have a 7-minute commute right now. If I had a 30-minute commute by car, that would not be a big deal. If I didn't have a car and I was living where I live now, it would be very difficult for me to get to where I currently live. And it would be very difficult. It would shrink that circle of places that I could work, right? If there's no one in your organization that thinks like that, that's had maybe a lived experience that identifies with that, you may jump right on board and say, you know what, multimodal transportation, all systems go. It is, I've heard it said before, they're in a car, they can go around the block, they can make it 5 minutes long. Well, what about the person who can't afford a car, right? And who needs a car because that's going to transform their life in a way that we can't even begin to, to identify with.
That's great. I mean, that's good anecdote. And I think we've all kind of encountered those similar issues. And we could probably do a whole episode on that squeaky wheel issue alone. But that's going to do it. We're at the end of our hour. I want to thank my colleagues on the podcast, on the panel here. Always great to see you. Always great to talk to you. That concludes another installment of Generation on the Rise. And we hope our listeners will tune in to next week's recording and looking forward to connecting again. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, guys.
Bye. See ya.
Yeah.